everybody. My name is Rachel Jones-Ross. I'm a landscape and astrophotographer from Canmore, Alberta. It's been my pleasure for the last few years to be part of Sony's condo event, and I was crushed, as I'm sure many of you were, to learn that condo had to be canceled this year. I'm really grateful to Sony for finding a way of bringing us all together and for giving me the opportunity to share some of my passion for photography with you. So thank you all for being here, and a huge thank you to Sony for hosting this event. Today I'm going to share a little bit of insight on night photography with you. This class is actually the introduction to my 10-day long online workshop in night photography. So if you are interested in learning more, I will be offering my online workshop at the end of July and then again at the end of August. And just to give you an idea that this is an introduction, night photography is this huge topic, and there's a lot that we could cover. And there's only so much we can do in 40 minutes. So yeah, with that said, I am really excited to share with you today some of my images and learning from the field. When people find out that I do night photography, the first question that they always ask is, oh, if I was going to go out and shoot the Milky Way, what settings would I use? And I always giggle just a little bit because, you know, if you go out during the day and you have average light conditions, chances are you can shoot at f8 or f11 and, you know, a pretty fast shutter, and you're going to get a good shot. I mean, you can take your cell phone out and get a good shot without too much effort. But at night, the light changes from night to night, and you know, that can be dependent on the location that you're at, or even at the exact same location, the light can be wildly different every night. So I can visit the same location every night for 30 nights, but the moon is going to rise and set at different times, and there's going to be different levels of illumination. So really, moon and light pollution and all kinds of things factor into what kind of settings you're going to be able to use at night. You're going to be shooting anywhere from wide open apertures at f2.8 to maybe f16 in a full moon. I want to talk to you today about how to make some of those calls about what settings to use, some of the challenges that we have with night photography, and some of the techniques we can use for overcoming those challenges. So this image, for example, is a blend of several different images. I shot this during a workshop here in the Canadian Rockies on a very early February morning. It was the first signs of the Milky Way core. I think that we had about 25 minutes to get the shot of the stars from the time that the Milky Way first appeared until the sun started to come up and washed it out. And I knew going into this shoot that it was too dark to get the foreground, like all these beautiful frost flowers and everything that is in this image, all sharp at the same time as the stars. So I knew that I wanted to photograph the stars, and I was working with the 12 to 24 G series lens, which is an f4, which means it doesn't have as much light gathering ability as, say, a 2.8. So I had to really work with that lens, and to get around the limitations with Aperture, I shot at a really high ISO. I shot at 16,000, and then I took 20 of those shots and stacked them for noise reduction, and then I blended those with 5 focus stacked images from Blue Hour. So I'm going to explain all of that. It sounds like a lot, but it just gives you an idea that you know, it's hard to just show up and get a shot and get a good shot in the middle of the night of the Milky Way or of any other sort of dark scene. When we think about night shooting, we have to think about all of the different challenges. So the first one is our shutter. A longer shutter is going to allow more light onto the sensor. That's awesome. The trade-off there is that we might also get star trails. So the longer we leave the shutter open, the more likely that our beautiful light stars, which are points of light, are going to look more like little lines or dashes. And that's because the Earth is always moving in relation to the sky. And then the other thing that can happen is if there's any kind of movement, so maybe you have somebody standing in your shot, or maybe there's some treetops that are just being gently blown by the wind, anything with movement is just going to look really blurry. So we have to be careful with the longer shutter speeds for star trails and any kind of movement in the shot. This is an example of star trails. So this image is almost straight out of camera. I tweaked it a little bit, the contrast and the color, just so you could see a little bit more clearly. But I've blown up a section of it so that you can see the stars are trailing. This one was a shot that was wide open for 30 seconds, or I think it was actually f8 for 30 seconds. And because it was open for a long time, you can see that the stars are trailing just a little bit, but it's noticeable. So if I was to blow this up and hang it on my wall, I wanted to create a print out of it, you would definitely see that movement. The final image, I took a separate shot for the mountain and the foreground from the sky. The sky was 20 images stacked for noise reduction, and you can see that those stars are really sharp points of light. Like there's no movement in there whatsoever. So the bloating that you see around the stars, that little halo of light, that happens when we have clouds or something like that in front of our light source, and it kind of make it look bloated. So that's not something I did in post. I think it's a really dreamy, kind of pretty effect. But if you look at all of the corner sharpness and everything like that, those stars are really nice and sharp. So to get sharp stars, I use photopills. Photopills it's such a handy tool for any kind of photography, but as a night photographer, I can't recommend it highly enough. It has a function called spot stars that if you enter your camera make and model, so it takes into account your sensor information, your aperture that you're shooting at, your focal length, it'll tell you how long you can leave your shutter open based on your particular camera without getting star trailing. It'll give you two different readouts. The first readout, the default, is barely noticeable star trails. So if you were to post this online, nobody would ever notice that the stars are trailing just a little bit. And then the second readout is accurate, useful for large prints. And so this is the one that you would use if you eventually wanted to print that image and, blow it up 3 feet wide and hang it on a wall, because then the stars are going to be nice, sharp little points of light. So photopills and spot stars are really good. The sort of older method for doing this, for figuring out a shutter time, was to follow the 500 rule. So I don't know if you're familiar with that, but basically it was to take 500 and divide it by your focal length, and that would give you the maximum amount of time you could leave your shutter open before the stars would begin to trail. However, our cameras are so technologically advanced now that rule is really antiquated, and you're almost sure to get star trails unless you're shooting on a really old body. But any of these new cameras and the Sony cameras, you really have to have shorter shutter times and take into account the technology and the sensor that your camera has. So photopills, can't recommend that one enough to determine your shutter speed. Okay, so that's shutter. Aperture. Aperture is even more challenging than shutter. So, typically, especially if we're shooting, say, the Milky Way, we're going to be shooting at wide open apertures. This means f2.8. Sometimes we don't have f2.8 and we have to work with f4. It doesn't let as much light into the camera, or you have to leave the shutter open longer. Or you might have something that's even faster. Maybe it's a 1.4 or a 1.8. But typically, on a really dark night, we're shooting at wide open apertures, whatever wide is for our particular lens. The trade-off there is that wide open apertures have a really shallow depth of field. So if you think about this from the point of view of a portrait photographer, shallow depth of field is amazing because it allows us to isolate our subject. If we're focused on our subject at a wide open aperture, everything behind them is going to be bokeh. And that's a really lovely quality in a lens for a portrait photographer. However, if we are using wide open apertures and we want to photograph some frost flowers or some pretty summer mountain flowers in the meadow, we don't want our stars to be bokeh. We want everything to be sharp from corner to corner. So these wider apertures have the trade-off of shallow depth of field, which means that we're going to have to do some focus stacking or something to combat that shallow depth of field to get an image that's sharp from corner to corner. So if you've never done focus stacking, it's actually really, really easy. I have a quick little demonstration here. This is shot on, so you're seeing the back of my Sony a7R III. I have touchscreen enabled, and this is daytime, so obviously I can use autofocus. But basically, I just set the first focal point to be the mountain, and then I moved towards the foreground, and I'm taking several images, all with the same settings, and the only thing that changes is the focal point. So then when I take it into post, I can just tell Photoshop to stack those images together, and it actually does a really good job as long as you kind of work in order and you go either back to front or front to back, not back, front, middle. It'll do a really good job of creating that depth map and stacking the images for you. And so then once you have put it through that stacking sequence, you'll end up with a single image like I have here on the right that's sharp all the way through from corner to corner. So I have just a quick little demonstration here. In this video, I have 5 images, all that have different focal points, and I've brought them into Photoshop. I've put them all in the layers panel so that I can see them. I've started off with my focus on the mountain, and you can see that when I'm focused on the mountain, my foreground isn't sharp. When my foreground is sharp, and this is at f11, and I move my focal points back towards the mountain, so the mountain becomes blurry when the foreground is sharp, and vice versa. So I'll play that one more time and try to do a better job of explaining it. So in these 5 images, I started with my focus on the mountain at the back. And you can see when I'm focused on the mountain that even at f11, my foreground is blurry. My focal point moves from the mountain to the midground to the foreground, and when I get to the foreground, it's beautifully sharp. But when I'm focused on the foreground and you look at the mountain is not so sharp. So I need to focus stack to be able to get everything in focus from corner to corner, and that's at f11. So now imagine an even wider aperture like f2.8. I'm going to need even more focal points to get the whole image in focus from corner to corner. Okay, so that's shutter speed and aperture. The last consideration then is ISO. So if we increase the ISO, we are increasing the light sensitivity of the camera, but the trade-off there is that higher ISO equals more noise. And noise can look like different things. So it can look like this image. There's a combination of different things going on here. First of all, it's really grainy. That's one type of noise. And then another thing you'll notice is that there's blotchy colors. There's some blues and some pinks and some yellows. It's just, it's not very even. And so that's color noise. And that all comes with higher ISO. When you combine high ISO with a wide aperture and you're focused on something like the stars, your foreground essentially just looks like mush. So here, the bit of the image that I've enlarged is the foreground. I am focused on the stars, and my ISO is set to 16,000. So you can see that that foreground is just really blurry and mushy. To get around that, I'm going to have to do some focus stacking, probably during blue hour, so that I can get it in 5 shots instead of 25 shots. And also, sometimes it's really hard to focus stack in the dark and be able to get all parts of the scene. So in super dark conditions, I'm more likely to do a blue hour blend. If I have some light to work with at night, I always try to use the natural light in the scene. So the resulting image then is the one that we started this conversation with. The frost flowers are really sharp in the foreground. The image is sharp all the way through. I've been able to capture the stars. Even using an f4 lens, it did a really good job. I just had to compensate for the limited ability of that lens to let in light. So when I'm on location, I am always thinking about how do I capture each part of the scene independently from other parts of the scene so that it all has the right exposure, so that it's all sharp, and so that I can combine it in post. And this takes a little bit of practice thinking about how things are going to come together in post, but the first thing to think about is, how do I best capture the stars? Do I have any foreground that I need to work with? Is anything moving? Do I need to isolate something that's moving and use a shorter shutter or photograph it during blue hour so that I can get it at a sharper aperture? So I always think about photographing each and every individual part of the scene separately and then combining that all together in post. One of the things that is super helpful when you're out on location is not having to turn a light on and off every single time you want to change a setting. So if you don't know your way around your camera really well, one of the things you can do is just find a dark room in your house, in the comfort of your warm house. Find and practice finding your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter, and practice changing those settings without having to turn on a light. If you can navigate your camera in the dark, it's going to speed up your workflow, and it'll be less annoying for anybody who is out there shooting with you, because if you have to turn on your light every time you change a setting, then chances are you're going to interrupt somebody else's shoot who's standing next to you. You also want to be able to find your 2-second timer. 2-second timer is really important in, or a remote trigger works as well, but to be able to press the shutter button and remove your hands from the camera when you're doing a long exposure, you really don't want to have any shutter shake by pressing the shutter and having the camera click immediately. So 2-second timer or a remote trigger works really well. So when I'm shooting, I kind of have 3 sort of broad categories of images in mind. The first is single images. So this would be, I show up and I click the button, click the shutter, and I get a great image that is sharp enough and evenly exposed, and basically I don't have to do too much to it other than, get the color the way that I want it, or, the highlights and shadows the way that I want them to. Those kinds of images seldom ever happen. So there are situations which they do. So anytime that I'm photographing and a body of water, like a reflection, is my foreground, that tends to lend itself really well to a single image type of exposure. As long as there's not really different light, so if you have a bright light, say on a building or a lodge or something like that, and it overpowers the light of the stars, you might need to get those in two shots. So things that tend to work well as a single image are if you either don't have a foreground or water is your foreground, or if everything in the image is on a single plane of focus off in the distance. So the mountains, stars, whatever it is that you're photographing are all on the same plane of focus, and they're all very distant from the lens. This particular image was shot in Iceland, and I shot it at f8. So I was able to use f8 and get this incredibly sharp image because it was a full moon night. So I had full moon and I had aurora, and that allowed me to really push my aperture and work in a sharper aperture range. I didn't have to work at f2.8. I still used ISO 3200 to make sure that I captured the aurora, and it was a 5-second exposure. If the aurora had been moving much more or dancing much more, I would have had to have used a shorter shutter time. In fact, like even half an hour later, I had to shorten the shutter to capture the movement. So most of the shots that I do are actually blends. So you can think about them like a time blend maybe. Basically, a blend is I've taken several images, I haven't moved the tripod, and then I combine those images in post to get something that has overall exposure and overall sharpness. So this image is a good example. It uses several different blending methods. One is that it's focus stacked. So I used the natural light of the scene and took 3 shots of the foreground. And then it's an exposure blend as well, because in this situation, if I get the right exposure for the stars, the light on the lodge actually blows out the whole scene. So I had to be able to photograph the stars separately from the lodge and then do an exposure blend. And blending that all together, focus stacking, I used Photoshop, their program for that. So it's just it's an easy script to run, but the exposure blend I had to do by hand. This image is also a blend, but it's just a focus stack in the foreground. This was shot just recently on the 12-24 f2.8 Master lens. This is a beautiful lens. It's so sharp. The quality of it is just so beautiful. And I was really amazed that I could get this kind of sharpness at f2.8. So this is a wide open shot. It's a short shutter, but I had a full moon rising and it happened to intersect with twilight. So I got that beautiful pink tone in the clouds and a little bit of light in the clouds. It kind of looks like a sunrise or a sunset, but if you look closely, there are stars in the image, but it is a full moon night, so those stars are really faint. I did have to focus stack those rocks in the foreground that are under the water, and the one on the right that's revealed above the water because of the shallow depth of field. So it's a focus stack, but everything from those front rocks onward is a single shot. This one was a different kind of blend for me. I did end up doing a stacked exposure for the sky and for noise reduction. So I took 20 images at ISO 6400 and I stacked those using Starry Landscape Stacker. It was a bit of an experiment because I had aurora, but this was not aurora in Iceland. This was aurora in the Canadian Rockies in the springtime. So this is actually May. It kind of looks like maybe more winter, but there was very, very little snow and ice left. I just gravitate towards it when I find it. So the aurora here is actually typically, unless it's a really big aurora storm, you have to be facing north to photograph it. Obviously, with the Milky Way rising up here behind the mountain, I'm in a southeast facing location. And when I was shooting, I was actually only planning on shooting the Milky Way, but then just out of nowhere, all of my foreground and my mountaintops turned blazing nuclear green. I had no idea what was going on until I turned around and looked behind me and the aurora was kicking off. Of course, not in the direction where I could actually get some aurora in my sky. Anyway, it did swing around just briefly and graced the one side of my image. And it was really just a kind of a faint band of light. And I was able to do really short exposures. I think these are 2 seconds. I did 20 of them and with like a 1 second interval. So I was able to bring out the green of the aurora by stacking the images for noise reduction and shooting at a really high ISO. The foreground here was shot at f3.5, and I think it's the mountain and the foreground all at the same time, and that was 30 seconds. I might have done this differently. This wouldn't make for a very good blue hour blend because if I were to shoot this during blue hour, I wouldn't have the green of the aurora on the mountains, and it would just change. It would just change all the light in the scene. Like it wouldn't match somehow. So I had to capture the light that was there, that was existing, and I had to work quickly because the aurora didn't last for very long. This one's a different kind of blend. This one is actually a perspective blend, so I used 2 different focal lengths here. The mountain was shot at 21 millimeters and the foreground was shot at 18 millimeters. It just happened to be that when I got there, I started working like 5 feet to the left and I had all this luscious fog rolling through the valley, and the comp that I had picked out worked really well at 21 millimeters. Then I got that shot, and then I just moved over a little bit to the right and I saw this and I was like, oh, this is amazing, but it didn't fit in my 21 millimeter lens. So I busted out the 18 millimeter prime and started shooting. But as I was shooting, the fog had just completely dissipated from the valley and the shot really wasn't the same without it. So I decided to blend the 21 millimeter mountain with the 18 millimeter foreground, and the fog made that blend really, really easy. But the scene as you see it is the way that it appeared, just different focal lengths. The constellation Orion that you see there, it actually does reflect in the water and everything lined up as you see it, but the way that I captured it, I had to use 2 different focal lengths to put it together. And then this is probably one of the more complicated blends I've done in a long time. Some of you may have seen this image before, but it's 20 images stacked for noise reduction for the sky. I shot, my subject is actually my daughter, and I shot that in early blue hour with a really short shutter, so all the creases in her dress are nice and crisp and every hair is well defined, and nothing's really blowing or blurry. There's no movement from long exposures and breezes or anything like that. And then I also did a little bit of light painting a little bit later on after Brooke had left the scene, and just to help me blend together what I knew was going to be really dark rocks with the sky that I had. So there's a little bit of light painting here, there's a blue hour shot, there's a little bit longer of an exposure for the waterfall, shorter exposure for the stars. It was a lot of images put together. It also took me about 18 hours of editing, so I'm happy with how it turned out. Okay, so I've covered single exposures and blends. Blends is definitely where I spend most of my time. The last category for me is composites. I don't do this a whole bunch, but these work a lot like blends, except for that I've moved the camera, or maybe I've taken the sky from one location and blended it with the foreground from another location. I don't do composites a lot, but the process is really similar to doing a blend. Sometimes it's necessary, like you show up and you get totally skunked for conditions, so maybe a composite is the way to go. And sometimes they're just fun to create, like this one here. I always try not to create composites that might inspire somebody to buy a plane ticket, rent a car, get a hotel room, and go shoot some iconic location to get the Milky Way over it if it doesn't exist there. So when I do Milky Way composites, I'm conscientious to do those in an indiscriminate place, somewhere where that's not going to inspire somebody to travel, like this image of these rocks here with this cactus in front of it. So as I mentioned, they work a lot like blends. This particular one, I did a blue hour blend. So I shot the cactus and the rocks during blue hour at f11 ISO 100. Each shot was 30 seconds, and it's important to note that when I was shooting this, my exposure meter was reading 0. So again, this is a focus stack. There's probably 5 or more shots here to get the foreground all sharp from corner to corner. And then I combined it with a sky that I shot elsewhere. Same part of the world, same night actually, but just shot in a different place. So what you're seeing here is a TIFF that has already been run through Starry Landscape Stacker, which is the program that I use to stack images for noise reduction. This is basically raw. There's no edits that have been done here except for to stack it. So, it looks like kind of a flat image, but you can see that there's some pink in there. You can see that there's some bloating around that star, and that the colors, there's some really nice colors down towards the horizon. So Typically, if I'm taking shots to stack for noise reduction, I'm doing 20 at a time, and there just needs to be an even interval between the shots for the program to read them and align the stars. But it's actually a really cool program and allows for some really clean Milky Way images, even if you're shooting with, say, an f4 lens. A little bit about cameras and how to set up the cameras then. Sony has some really beautiful features that make night shooting a pleasure. One of those is bright monitoring. Bright monitoring, I'm not really sure how to explain the technical side of what goes on. I think it's like internal camera magic, but basically it boosts the gain so that you can see in your live view, like on the back of your camera or in the viewfinder, what it is that you're actually seeing in the dark. So I did a quick little screen recording that you can see here. This is what it looked like to my eye. There was a little bit of light from the aurora. I could see the silhouette of the mountain. Then I turned bright monitoring on, and now all of a sudden I could see all the details of the foreground, what the ice looked like, all the frost flowers that were around me. So bright monitoring allows us to quickly and easily find a composition even in the dark. This is not helpful if we are trying to focus, because when you go to focus, it kicks bright monitoring off. What it is really good for is finding a composition in the dark. This just makes, instead of having to do like a test shot and then waiting for it and then looking at the back of the camera and then making an adjustment, you can do all of that in real time. So this is definitely probably one of the smartest features for night shooting that I've ever worked with, and I can't recommend this one highly enough. This one has to be programmed to a custom button for it to work. So for me, I have this set to custom button number 2. It's really easy to program your custom buttons. The menus are a little bit different from camera to camera, but basically you're going to go to your custom key setting and then just choose bright monitoring, which is different than brightness something or other. There's another one that's really similar in the menu, but bright monitoring, at least on the A7R3, is on page 18, and this is the one that's going to help you see a little better in the dark. I do have actually a little write-up on my website if you're interested in a little bit more in-depth tutorial on how to set it up. So I will include a link to that. So this is how my Sony cameras are set up. My cameras are all set up the same so that I don't have to struggle when I change from one camera to another. But essentially my C1 is focus magnification. This one's a really important one for night shooting. When you magnify into your scene for focus and you use just the lens, typically you're only going to get 6 times magnification that way. But if you use the focus magnifier, and mine's set to C1, then you can get 12 times magnification. So you can imagine if you're trying to focus on something as small as a star, that you're going to be a lot more accurate with 12 times magnification than you are with 6 times magnification. As I mentioned, bright monitoring is on my C2. I can't live without this one. It's on all of my cameras. I also have Steady Shot set up as a custom button on the back of my camera, something I can find easily at night, and make sure that it's turned off when I'm on a tripod. That's really important. And then finally, the touch screen, as I demonstrated. It's not something I use at night, but it's very helpful when I'm trying to focus stack really quickly in quickly changing light conditions like blue hour. So I use the touch screen function quite a bit. At least for the blue hour portions of a lot of the shoots that I do. People always ask me about cameras and lenses and what gear I use. Obviously I love Sony. I started off on the Sony A7S. This little camera is a low light monster. The night images that come out of this are just incredible, but as a commercial photographer, I really struggled with the limitations of the 12 megapixel resolution. So I ended up getting the Sony A7R II, and that, again, beautiful camera. And since then, I've just moved up to the Sony a7R III. I also have the Sony a7 III, which is kind of the mid between those two. It's the 24 megapixel. For a long time, I vowed to myself I would never sell my Sony a7S. Then at one point, I had been hauling around 3 or 4 camera bodies to pretty much every location I ever went to, and I seldom ever used the a7S. So I sold it, and then I had instant regrets. And about a month ago, I made a trade so that I could get my hands on the a7S again, only to learn that the a7S III is coming out. I'm so excited about that. I can't even tell you. So I have a long history with that Sony a7S. That is such a beautiful camera for night shooting. I sometimes reach for the a7 III. It's just that mid-ground between the high resolution of the R3 and the light sensitivity of the a7S. I also use it for video. It's a beautiful camera. I recommend it to anybody who's just starting out, or maybe it's their first full frame camera. It's got a lot of really great features. So my workhorse though is the Sony a7R III. I do use it for night shooting. I typically will, it just depends on the amount of light that I have. On really, really dark nights, I will end up doing the stacked images for noise reduction like I showed you for the sky, and combining those with a blue hour foreground. But there's lots of times when you can get a single image, or when you have just enough light that you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. So I guess the long and the short of it is you can use any Sony camera and get really beautiful pictures at night. But when you move towards the a7S line, you're going to have more light sensitivity. And when you move towards the a7R III line, you're going to have more resolution and less light sensitivity. When it comes to lenses, I love shooting primes for nighttime. Primes are very sharp lenses, like the Sony 24mm 1.4 G Master. That lens is perfection. It's the sharpest lens. It's so good, and there's no sort of coma in the corners on the stars and stuff like that that is very typical of a zoom lens. The trouble for me is that I do a lot of hiking and I do a lot of traveling, and I need to minimize how much weight I'm carrying with me. There are times when I choose to not take deodorant or cut the handle off my toothbrush or whatever, because, as a friend mentioned not too long ago in a conversation, he said, ounces equal pounds and pounds equal pain. So I'm always really careful about what lenses I choose and what bodies I choose to bring with me. I want to bring the right equipment for the job. And so often that means bringing the zooms because they're more versatile. So typically my favorite lens really for composition is the 12 to 24. The G series lens is the one that I've had in my bag for the last year. But sometimes it just didn't give me enough light sensitivity that I could, say, run a time lapse with it or something like that. So in that case, I always had the 16 to 35 f2.8 G Master lens with me, and often I had to choose between that fast lens that was better with low light or the wide lens that was not so good with low light. And now with the 12 to 24 G Master, it just totally changed my whole world. I'm so excited that I've had a chance to try that out. It's a beautiful lens, and I can see that changing the kit that I bring with me everywhere. All right, so just a quick little note about accessories then. I do use a few accessories very regularly. One of them is the Luxley Viola. This is a really good light for any kind of night photographer because it has 99 different brightness settings, and you can change the color or the color temperature. So you can actually match the color temperature of the light to the color temperature of the camera. That's pretty fascinating, and just gives you all kinds of options for low-level lighting, for light painting, and really working with tricky situations. The other sort of must have in my bag, this is more for winter shooting, is those gloves by the Heat Company. These are the world's warmest gloves. I work in really cold conditions. It's often minus 35 Celsius when I'm out in the wintertime, in the deep winter of the Canadian Rockies. And with these gloves, I've never had to worry about frostbite or anything like that. So I highly recommend those for anybody who's interested in traveling to cooler climates. They're kind of must-haves on my workshops here in the Canadian Rockies in the wintertime. Aside from that, I mean, all of this stuff I can recommend. I have an Atlas pack that I absolutely love for anything, for travel, for hiking. The way that they're designed, they keep the weight really close to your back, and that gives me more balance, and I just feel more nimble when I'm trying to climb up a mountain. So they're also great for travel. Highly recommend that. And as many of you know, I'm a longtime supporter of Slick USA tripods, really good quality tripods and amazing customer service. So do check them out if you're looking for a new tripod. The last one that I'll mention is just a lifesaver for anybody, especially anybody new to astrophotography. If you've ever struggled with focus, this is for you. This is a Sharp Star filter by Lonely Spec. It is basically just a little plastic filter that you don't leave on the camera, you just use it to focus. So what happens when you put it on is you want to aim it at a really bright star, and it kind of separates the light, and it turns the light into an X shape. And then when you get your focus in the right place, you'll have a line that intersects that X. So it just makes focusing really easy, and it will give you that assurance, even if you have poor vision, that you've actually focused your camera correctly. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. I use this if I'm, say, testing a new lens. I don't know how it focuses up, or, you know, anytime I'm trying a new piece of equipment, I want to make sure that if I'm seeing something, you know, coma in the corners or something off, that it's not user error, that it's, you know, that it's actually in focus. And I have really poor vision in my left eye, so this will just help anybody who struggles with focus to be a little bit more confident that their stars are going to be really sharp. So I think it's only available through Lonely Spec, but definitely worth checking out. I truly believe that if you can master night photography, you can master any kind of photography. It is very technically challenging, and it really makes you think through how to get the best results out of your camera. And then you can enter any kind of low light situation, or really any situation, and be confident in your skills. So if you are interested in learning more about night photography, do look me up. I have that online class coming up. I want to thank you guys so much again for joining me. I am really excited to be here, and I would love to nerd out with you about astrophotography, so please stick around. I will be here to answer any questions that you might have, and just talk night photography. So thanks again for tuning in, and thank you so much to Sony for hosting this event.